Okay, now you're a tough act to follow, Ursula, I've got to tell you. Way better with the academics earlier. A lot of the speakers this morning have reminded me that I really live and work in a niche community. The ethical fashion space in the US in particular, despite this English accent, I live in New York and I work for FIT, it's not a representative space of certainly of America or of the fashion industry for that matter. I live in an area called Dumbo, which stands for down underneath the Manhattan Bridge underpass, or overpass actually. And it's a really cool little artisanal space where basically the bulk of people living there are artists, makers, designers, etc. In fact, down the road from me is the single largest rooftop organic garden, I think, in the US. We have a community garden on the top of our rooftop in the apartment building I live in. No, this is not it. Recycling textiles and composting food is just part of our daily life. It's what we do. And we do not have 200 square foot closets. Space in New York is at a premium. I think probably the average size of an apartment is about 650 square feet. So nobody has a 200 square foot apartment. And I personally don't own a single pair of jeans. So clearly I'm not representative. I'm also not representative as an educator. I really talk not about quantitative research, but qualitative. It's about telling the stories, mostly because I work in the commercial space rather than the educational space. My writing is almost all published, but for magazines, e-zines, websites, journals, etc., so my own books. So it's a very different space. And I do wear my ethics, so this is an Austrian designer, KMA, Kathahara, who works entirely with upcycled materials. So this particular jacket is made from the tiniest of selvage scraps from production, and the whole thing is just sort of all scrumpled together and stitched on top, and she makes an exquisite collection. If you were here yesterday at the Next Big Thing conference, one of the slides that they showed from Liedelcourt was a phenomenal chocolate jacket that was sort of very sculpture in shape. That was actually one of KMA's as well. It was a Kathahara. So what I do basically is I'm a writer, researcher, and sort of an academic, quasi-academic. My background's working with women's cooperatives, so that's what this slide is here. Mostly in the craft sector and the creative industries. I've worked a lot with education, governmental agencies, NGOs, for-profits, mostly in the developing world. So I write about ethical fashion, for want of another title. Sustainable fashion, fair-traded fashion, the whole sort of range of things that people are doing that have ethics in how they produce. But I also speak about design because I think it's equal to sustainability. There's no point producing more ethical, ugly clothing. There's enough of it already produced. We don't need to produce more. So these particular images are from a cooperative I probably work with more than any other one, which is Copahaca in Rio in Brazil. They're in the largest favela, which is slum in South America, actually, 180,000 residents. That's the favela there on the right. That's some of the women from the cooperative on the left. And they have a particularly unique background. Not currently, but their tradition is working with high-level designers from Cacharel to Paul Smith to any number of different brands, Brazilian brands, Carlos Miele, the Campana brothers, so not just in fashion, and working with a lot of traditional techniques, not particularly heritage techniques. Brazil, and particularly the favelas, tend to be populated by Nordinistas, women who have moved to that area from the northeast because of droughts, because of the idea that moving to a city, maybe they're going to have a higher standard of living, they might be able to provide for their families better than they can in an agrarian society. And of course the reality is that's not the truth. They're prejudiced against, they don't have equal access to education or to work, and so on, so they end up living in the favelas, which is a very underground type economy. These are not cities that were planned, these are cities that were built by the people that moved there, found some land, and they just built upwards. There is no formal electrical system, there's no street signs, there's no numbers, there's no anything, there's no postal service, there's no bus service. These are entirely self-built communities and really quite beautiful in their own way. They are also quite commercially successful in their own way, that people do have to produce all sorts of things. So this particular cooperative is, as I said, Copenhagen, and they have worked with major designers as well as mass market. They work with C&A, have done for a number of years, and produce absolutely exquisite clothing, handmade, crochet, fushiko, patchwork, embroidery, all ranges of different craft types. These are images of my first book. It's funny, this was published in 2010. The term eco-fashion is now a word I would never use. So it's really dated in terms of title, not in terms of content. In fact, that's a piece on the front cover is by Natalie Channing from Alabama Channing, which you saw in one of the other presentations, and she wrote the foreword for my first book. And in fact, Ursula is one of the only brand that's in both my books. So
I have to tweet that one.
You are, actually. So what I do basically, whether it's in my publishing or my speaking or whatever, is I try and honor what groundbreaking designers are doing in the terms of fashion and accessories under the very broad title of ethical fashion, eco-fashion, whatever you want to call it. For the first book, it was broken into 5 categories. It's very difficult and really not very effective to label things, because very few designers that work in the emerging and the sustainable space really don't do a single thing. They do multiple things. So when you try and say this is an upcycling designer or this is someone who's working with fair trade, they tend to do multiple things. But for reasons of publishing, you do have to find some ways of breaking down and titling and siloing and so forth. So the basic categories in this book, and I tend to use, are community and fair trade, ecological and slow design, recycle, reuse, new business models, and designer initiatives, because it's also really important what the big brands are doing. They may not be ethical, they may not be sustainable, but what they are doing to address those issues. When this book came out in 2010, and it's not that long ago, it really was, relatively speaking, an important book, because at that time all the publishing that was around was lumping fashion design in under anything to do with ethical design. So you'd get like a recycled table next to a slogan, organic cotton t-shirt. There was nothing about design. It was all about ethics. It was all about what was being done by the NGOs for the most part. So it was really important, I felt, to honor what designers were doing that were groundbreaking from an aesthetical perspective as well as an ecological perspective, because there simply weren't models for people to refer to. And because most of that work is being done in the emerging space, it tends to be it's not very well communicated. So for example, what a contemporary felting designer is doing in Valparaiso, Chile, or what a jewellery designer is doing with Nottingham lace in Nottingham, or any number of different spaces. It's so regionalised and so small, I felt it was really important to start communicating all these incredible designers around the world that I have the opportunity and the great fortune to be able to meet and talk about and write about. So that really was the premise behind all of my writing, but particularly these books, because I felt as designers in the industry or as students about to graduate in the industry, we needed to see what was possible. We needed to communicate what examples there already were out there that were doing just amazing work. So this is the second book, which came out last year. I want to say, no, October of the year before, in fact, end of October 2013. And this grew out of the first book, basically because there are so many designers working with upcycled materials around the world that I couldn't fit it in a single chapter. I could have written a whole book about British designers, and as I said, Ursula is the only designer that's featured in both books. So it grew out of that because there was just so much great work being done with recontextualizing textiles and really recontextualizing materials. When you think of luxury fashion, you think of high-end fashion, the important components of it, or one of the most important components, is luxury fabrication. That you're paying for expensive fabrics. But there are a number of designers that are completely challenging that and making really luxury designs, beautiful, exquisite clothing out of other people's waste. And that's about recontextualizing materials, and that doesn't make it any less luxurious. In fact, in many ways it's more. And so I thought it was really important to talk about the designers that were challenging what luxury design meant and what good design meant and what materials you could utilize to do that. These are sophisticated designers for the most part, working with labor-intensive workmanship. No one will tell you more than Ursula how difficult it is to work with people's waste, different sizes of materials, non-consistent materials, etc. So these are creative challenges that a number of designers have found really great solutions to. So as I said, what I really do is tell the stories around designers that are working in the industry and making a difference. So I tend to focus on cutting edge design, I tend to focus on high-end conscious design, because that's my voice in this space. There are a lot of people talking about ethical fashion, mainstream fashion, and so on. So this is the space that I have the ability to make a difference. And I talk about it really because we can all relate to clothing. Everybody wears it. We all participate in the fashion system in some way, shape, or form. So it's a massive global employer, as you've already heard. So it has the ability to change how we do business. It has the ability to change how we consume. And those are really super important issues. So I think that by talking about emerging designers in the global space that are challenging these systems, and I spoke yesterday about challenging the system of fashion at all of its different intervention points is really important. So what I do mean is sort of address the main issues of fashion. So I told you basically the categories. So I'm going to break it into those sort of 4 or 5 categories that I discussed and just break it into, show you a couple of examples of the designers that are making a difference. And why are they making a difference and why is it important. So ethical materials or ecological materials, however one you call it, why is it important? Because it has 10 to 12% of pesticides in the world is used on the growing of a single crop, cotton. Don't want to pick on cotton, God knows it's much more ethically and sustainable than, say, polyester. Polyester doesn't even have, they haven't yet been able to work out how long it takes for polyester to biodegrade. They say it's not in a scalable timeline because it hasn't been around long enough. We don't know. It's something like plastic bags. Somewhere between 300 and 500 years is what it's estimated. It will take polyester and other synthetic materials to biodegrade. But we don't know that yet because it just hasn't been here for long enough. So that's pretty horrifying. You've got fabrics, of course. Polyester is an oil byproduct. It comes from the oil industry. So you have all of the issues connected with oil production. Because organic cotton is only 1% of cotton growth, 1% of the market worldwide, and that's static, hasn't grown for years. There is no additional growth in organic cotton growing. Because polyester, as I said, is a petroleum-based product, because fashion industry, as we've already heard, is the second largest water user in the world, second only to agriculture. So, and one of the largest polluters. Because in certainly your standard mainstream fabrics, there are about 2,000 to 3,000 chemicals that are commonly used on the finishing, dyeing, printing of our textiles. 2,000 to 3,000 chemicals. That's not on every piece of fabric, obviously, but those are common chemicals. I'm not talking about techno fabrics, I'm not talking about special finishes and so on. Skin is our single largest organ on our body. And we are only just beginning to think and talk about what effect wearing textiles next to the largest organ of our body that absorbs as well as excretes has on our health. We wear textiles from the minute we're born and we're wrapped in them once we die. And we never take them off. We go to sleep in them. They play one of the most intimate parts of our lives, our lingerie, all of the stories that we have attached to clothing. How many people have actually thought about how many chemicals are in the piece of clothing that they're wearing right now in their underwear, or covering their skin? This is a massive issue that, we are only just beginning to talk about. Detox was really the first big report that started to look at the chemicals, not just in our clothing, but we are washing in our washing machines and putting into our water tables and into our ground soil because of that. So those 2,000 to 3,000 chemicals that we commonly use, many of them are banned in many, many industries, but they are not banned in our textiles. So there's at least half a dozen or so of them that are categorized as 1 or 2 category dangerous chemicals by the EPA in the USA. We don't allow our cattle to eat the pesticides on GMO-grown cotton, but we actually allow it in the finishing of our garments that we wear against our skin every single day. It's really, really super scary. And when you start digging into this stuff, we use a lot of that cotton waste from chemically grown cotton in things like stuffing pillows that we sleep on. We use it in sanitary products. We use it in, yet we do not allow cows or livestock to eat that or to be exposed to those chemicals, which is pretty scary. Actually, I kind of totally ignored that slide, didn't I? Basically, this is some of the issues that the challenges. This is just a basic T-shirt. There are a number of issues with T-shirts. Standard waste, of course, in production is about 15% of garments of T-shirts. You're talking about a front, a back, a neckline, and 2 sleeves. So standard waste for cutting a T-shirt is about 30% actually. So it's much larger because you've got so few pieces and 2 of them are very large. So wastage of fabric, cotton production, I've already talked about, chemicals and so on, water use. Then we've got issues of how ethical is it to be growing crops when we have problems of should they be better utilised to grow food for the world that can't eat, you know, or doesn't have the ability to access. 36% of the climate impact is through post-consumer use, so washing, etc. And then landfills. The UK or Europe is so much better at recycling than we are in the US right now. I think the US, 75% of textiles currently end up in landfill, which is just absolutely abysmal considering somewhere around 95 to 99% of all textiles are recyclable in some way, shape and form. Downcyclable, upcyclable, reused in some way. Even if it's just stuffing car seats or whatever it is, they can be reutilized instead of going into landfill. And all of the issues that have already been mentioned about the problems that causes in landfill. Wool emits methane. Methane is one of the major contributors to global warming. So there are lots of issues. So what I really prefer to do is to talk about those are why it's important to address these issues. But there are designers out there that are doing amazing things. And I just want to show you some of the designers that are doing things to impact some of those problems. And they're doing it beautifully. This is Laura Strombi. She's an Italian designer based in Milan. She basically has a research collection, so it is available commercially, but it's not and it's a higher end. It's not sort of mass consumption by any stretch. She's basically a textile scientist, so all of her dyeing, printing, etc. is vegetable dyeing. So she works predominantly with tea infusions and other vegetable and floral extractions. And she uses a lot of biological growth methodology, so organic fabrics that are grown, colour grown. Her fabrics are mostly natural, so she works a lot with Pima cotton, very, very heavy weights. These are trans-seasonal collections, they're not seasonal, so cotton she uses as much in the winter as she does in the summer. She works with a lot of blends, as I said, as a textile scientist, cotton and silk, and bamboo, soy fibers, cashmere, all sorts of different fabrications. I'm not going to go into depth. There are a lot of issues about bamboo and whether you call that sustainable or you don't. Not enough time to even start on that. Her collection is entirely produced in Italy, so it is not offshored. And she works, or has worked for the last few seasons, a lot with digital printing. There are a lot of advantages to digital printing. A lot of designers choose to print only their pattern pieces, as opposed to wasting the dyes and the print on the wasted fabric. So there are obviously savings with that, and a lot of printing can be done with vegetable dyeing too. So all of the fabrications are organic. one of the parts that makes her quite unique, and this is part of, you know, the stories behind this clothing and reconnecting back to our material connection to what we wear and the importance of it. I don't think there's a single thing in my wardrobe these days that doesn't have a story attached to it, and that makes your investment in clothing entirely different than picking up something that costs you $5 at Primark or whatever. You've no idea where it came from, you've no idea who sewed it. So why would it be important to you? It doesn't cost you any more than a pizza, so you know, why shouldn't you discard it with as little concern as you do take out food that you had the night before? When you're investing in clothing, your investment in it and your need to keep it is much greater. I have with me today, every day, my Tamara Fogel bag. She makes out of a lot of recycled fibres. I don't think to bring it up here, but it's out of German flour sacks from the late 1800s, and it's a beautifully constructed bag. The fabric is, you know, antique, and I use that bag every single day to the extent that I've now put a lot of holes in it. Now, normally when you get a bag with holes in it, you go, okay, let's get rid of that. That's kind of useless. It's not serving its purpose anymore. But because of the investment I made in that, and I'm not talking about financial, I'm talking about emotional connection. I've patched it, I've darned it, I've done everything possible to keep this bag alive and to keep using it. And that is the true value in it, that it is going on and having a new lifetime and has new stories attached to it. So that is Laura Strumby. One of the things that makes her unique, which is what I started to say, is there's a story behind all of this. And the company name YOJ, each letter actually stands for something in Sanskrit. And initially the collection was inspired by the shape of those letters. So not so much now, but when you look back at her original collection, they are very sculptural in shape. So the collection is actually based on the letter O or the letter Y. So there are these beautiful constructed pieces that collapse in on themselves that were formed around the letters of the name, each of which has a meaning to her. This is a new brand, Reformation. They're based in LA. They've actually been around for a little while under different names and so on. She has her own factory, which used to be a bakery in LA, so she produces locally, produces in-house. In some ways, they're built on a sort of fast fashion model in terms of they don't have a spring, summer, fall collection. It tends to be relatively seasonless clothing, and it's constantly updated. It's constantly updated because she works with dead stock fabrics. So this is leftover fabrics in manufacturers' back rooms, all the things that did come up with the wrong color, or orders were cancelled, or any number of things. Also, dyes, printed fabric and dyed fabric that came out wrong, the lab dips, all that sort of stuff. So they're limited availability, so it's almost that sort of McDonald's mentality, buy it now because there's not very much of it made and it's not going to be around for very long because this was a limited production based on whatever was left over from some factory that I bought the fabric from. So she also repurposes vintage clothing in quite a few of her pieces, but everything is made out of recycled or upcycled dead stock. So recycling and why? Well, there are lots of reasons, and some of them have been touched on already. Certainly in the Western world, the average lifespan for a piece of clothing is 3 years. That's the average lifespan. So you're configuring into that extreme luxury that people hold on to for a very long time, and fast fashion that somebody may never wear before they throw away, or they buy it for a single evening and then it's discarded. So 3 years is not very long. As I said, 15% is standard waste for production. And that's not just about cutting clothing and the 15% of waste left from cutting out the clothing and the pieces left after you've cut it. It's also about in the dyeing and the printing and the growing and the finishing and the knitting and the spinning. That's 15% at every one of those stages. And so that is a massive amount of waste. As I said, synthetic fibers don't decompose in any scalable timeline. 95% of fabrics are recyclable, so there are so many reasons to upcycle materials. So here are a couple of designers that are doing just beautiful, exquisite collections out of upcycled materials. This is Marc Le Bihan, he's a French designer. He has an absolutely exquisite, romantic, beautiful collection. It's almost all in monochromatic, shades of white, black, and so on. He does a lot of shibori and dip dyeing, so It's dyed in small batches by him. His background is actually working in textiles. So he comes from a very old, prestigious textile family production factory called Manufacture des Gobelins in Paris, who date back to Louis XIV's time, and he was a weaver. So that's his background, and from that sort of love of textiles and artisanship and craftsmanship, his collection grew out of that. So when he started his own line, he upcycles a lot of vintage materials. And so a lot of silks, embroideries, beading, etc. Quite exquisite. You can see how ethereal and just beautiful his line is. They sell him in New York in ABC Carpet and Home, which is a particular store in New York that deals a lot with artisanship and global artisans around the world. So a lot of it is deconstructed from historical garments, so we'll buy single items from flea markets in Paris and upcycle them into this design, so they are again one-off, but absolutely exquisitely beautiful. And this is why I talk and I write about this, because it's about the inspirational quality of design. You know, fashion is inspirational, it's aspirational, and unless we appeal to that component of ethical design, it won't get any further. This is a Korean brand, Recode. They are a massive part of a massive conglomerate in South Korea called Kolon Industries, who have about a dozen or so licenses for major activewear brands. So they do, I'm trying to think of the golfer, Nicholas Cloud, what's his name? No, doesn't matter. Anyway, they do Head, which is the tennis brand. They do, so it's mostly active sportswear, golfing lines. They do actually also the license for Marc Jacobs, a number of other brands. So Recode are a spin-off of that, and they utilize waste. Very unorthodox waste, actually. So they use things like airplane seat covers, seat belts from cars, airbag, disused or damaged airbags from cars. So extremely unusual materials to upcycle, extremely limited. Every single piece is numbered. There may be 4, 5 or 6 pieces made of each design. They do collaborations with different designers, and it's a very unique collection, quite beautiful, and they work with a number of Korean and actually different global designers each time. What they don't do, however, and Ursula touched on this, is use their own waste. This is a massive industry. They own 12 different licenses, mass producing, and they do not utilize their own waste. Recode get outside waste to work with. So this is an incredible opportunity, and it's one that I think that, in fact, I keep referring to you, Ursula, that you're one of the few designers I know that has done this at a scale with Tesco's and with Asda and those brands. Brands utilizing their own waste is such an incredible opportunity. Think about how H&M work. Of all of the designer collaborations that they do, the high profile that they get when they do a Karl Lagerfeld line or a Comme des Garçons or whatever it is, how about if they were doing that with an incoming high profile designer to work with their own waste? The opportunities are massive. The bigger these brands are, the more waste that they are producing. These are opportunities that have not yet been seen, and they absolutely must be taken advantage of. And there's no reason why someone like an H&M shouldn't be doing something like that, and it shouldn't be getting as much publicity and PR as they do.
I know there are reasons. One thing, because it's really interesting, because upcycling really is the ultimate slowdown. Mm-hmm. Now you tell any, because you need to, you know, take stuff from the one. You talk to anybody right now about the word slowdown, they run away like lizards. You know, they just disappear. So I think it will become more. Sorry.
I agree. I think you're absolutely right. But it is an incredible opportunity that has yet to be realized. So community and fair trade. There are so many reasons why this is an important area for ethical design, whether it's Rana Plaza, whether it was the 4 garment workers that were shot in Cambodia simply for striking for a living wage, 23 of whom were imprisoned for more than 6 months, and all they were doing was striking for a peaceful strike for a rise in their living wage. These are all garment workers. Because there are so many traditional crafts, that are dying around the world because they're being replaced by mechanized systems, whether it's hand weaving, whether it's embroidery, incredible traditions that it's more than sin to relegate them to a history book. Whether you're talking about Uzbekistan, Suzani embroidery, or you're talking about Nottingham lace. It doesn't matter. These are incredible traditions that we have to hold on to in some way. Because artisans, for the most part, globally, can't sustain themselves, and they should be able to through their craft and through their skill and through their tradition. So, obviously, the costs of fast fashion are well documented. This is a Canadian and a British example, actually, of the cost of production. Basic, pretty standardized figures of, a third to two-thirds of material costs. You're talking about importing here, so you can see how large the percentages of that overall t-shirt on the agent, because you don't produce in Cambodia or Vietnam without having an import agent that can deal with the factories, that can deal with the shipping, the duty, and so on. They're getting more than the producer. 12% labour, that's in a top that probably has more than a dozen different processes, so more than a dozen different labourers worked on that. So they're getting less than a penny each, which is just diabolical. This was actually, that's actually a Canadian figure as opposed to an American. I know it's dollars, and this is British. This was a survey that the TUC did, so the unions, about would British people pay more at the till for something that they knew was produced safely and fairly, and what would that cost be? And I think it says 2 cents up there somewhere, so instead of a £6 t-shirt, how about £6 and 2 pennies to just double their wages? So these are a couple of companies that are doing interesting things in the ethical space, whether with slow fashion or processes. This is a brand new company. It's actually an FIT alum. She just presented for the first time in New York Fashion Week to a nice splash, actually. ABC, Carpet and Home were one of her sponsors, as were Avida. And she showed in the Highline Hotel, so I'm sure you know what the Highline is. It's the overground disused railway that's a beautiful now community garden. The Highline Hotel is just underneath that, so it's actually built in an old church. The presentation was stunning, absolutely beautiful. And it's produced from sustainably, organically Mongolian cashmere. It's all woven in Italy. Or knitted in Italy, but all the fibre is supporting nomadic herdsmen, which is a way of life that's dying out in Mongolia for a number of reasons. Overgrazing, so the natural habitat where the cashmere goats live is becoming unsustainable for them to continue to have cashmere herds. It's all natural colours, so the natural colours that the cashmere goats come in, so it comes through cream, beige, charcoal, grey, and black. And it's just the whole basis of the collection is actually on ethical production, so that it's available now at ABC is, of course, one of the companies that is selling them, and it's just exquisitely produced. You can see it has a really lovely sort of understated layered aesthetic, mostly knitted goods as opposed to woven. This is a brand out of Chile. There's really interesting things happening in Chile with a whole number of emerging designers working with tradition and craftsmanship. This is Zurita, which is Gabriela Ferraz Zurita is her name, and the brand is called Zurita. And what she does is honor and recontextualize traditional Andean textiles and weaving. So she works all with the indigenous Aymara and Tarapacá people, which are in the center of Chile. It's a very long country and very narrow, so it's quite diverse from the north to the south. You've got deserts, you've got coastline, you've got incredible variety of people, of groups, of all sorts of things. So her collection is really based around the concept of showing that slow fashion is something that can get a fair price and can compete against fast fashion. So all of the weaving, the spinning, and the dyeing is done naturally and is done by the Amara and the Tarapaka. So it's all done on 4-stake or 2-stake looms or backstrap looming, so it's all traditional and beautifully handmade done. It also follows and honors the tradition of those local groups. As with many Andean weavers, there's a very close connection to the weaving and their culture and their history. By tradition, you cannot, you should not cut the textiles. They consider the textiles part of their body, so by cutting fabric, you're cutting the body. And so her collection entirely honors that. So each piece is woven to the size and the shape that she requires for the collection, so none of it is actually cut in production, they're just sewed together. Which is the tradition, if you think of the poncho, it's 2 long pieces, there is no cutting on it, there's self-edges, there's edges, that's it. So she follows that tradition in all her pieces. So that's why you can see all the tops are really based on squares and rectangles. They're all produced that way. My background is really working with women's cooperatives and working with sustainable development in the developing world. So I have a profound respect for artisanship and craftsmanship, and particularly indigenous and culturally specific crafts that are particular to a location, a geographic location. So these images are actually both from a women's cooperative in Kabul, in Afghanistan, from a company called Roya that built a women's cooperative there that works in rediscovering tradition. Obviously Afghanistan has gone through, it's been decimated, their textile industry, because of all of the war for so long. So they were part of the Silk Road, and so they have an incredible textile history, much of which has been lost. So she works to rediscover traditional patterns, traditional weaves, and produces them in Afghanistan and works to incorporate them into her collection. And as I said, one of the biggest worries here is that some of these textiles and patterns will be relegated to the history books and no longer produced, and that's just of infinite sadness, I think. So just a couple of designers that are working to find different ways of helping to hold on to some of these traditions. This is a Chinese designer, Angel Chang, and she produces in Guizhou province in China. She's of Chinese descent in the UK and spends a great deal of time now there working with these two particular communities. One of the things that she tries to do is to communicate the racial and the cultural diversity of China. Most of us, when we think of China, we think, I mean, it's a massive country, but we think of it as a single people, and of course, like most countries, there's incredible diversity from one end to the other. And so these are two particular populations that she works with, which are the Mao and the Dong. And they have a long tradition of dyeing, of weaving, of indigo dyeing, that's all done locally. And they've held on to their tradition much longer than many other communities, simply because they're so remote. It's very difficult to get to them. And so unfortunately now, however, because they are they have this tradition of weaving, they've become a bit of a tourist area. So the local government, in the hope of trying to bring in new money to the community, because it's not a cash-rich community, has been using them a bit like a cultural showcase. So Angel is one of the designers, one of the people that's working against this. So she is helping to retrain women who return to those communities in their own tradition of weaving and of dyeing, because like most of this, the people that hold that tradition are very, very old, and it's in danger of dying out. So although most of the young people leave these cities when they're young, and I'm not talking about China in particular, I'm talking about a lot of different communities around the world, they leave it to have access to higher paid jobs, to live in cities, raise their standard of living, etc. Many do come back to these communities when they're ready to start families. And so she appeals to these women when they return to the community and pays them to learn how to reproduce these textiles that is in the tradition of their community. And in turn, that revalues their own heritage within themselves, because it now becomes a means for them to actually earn a real living. So it plays an important role in salvaging and saving these incredible traditions. This is an Indian designer, Swati Kalsi, who also does a very similar thing in India. Incredibly labor-intensive, hand-embroidered work, absolutely exquisite. You can't really see all the details here, but these are all entirely hand-done. So she really works with bringing contemporary design to the tradition of handcrafted Indian textiles, and she really repositions traditional Indian embroidery as innovative and unique and as part of the cultural heritage in India, but recontextualizing it. The last really area is new business models, because there are really interesting things happening there. I'm going to touch on these really quickly. Donna Karan's Urban Zen. Donna Karan, much like Calvin Klein, doesn't own her name anymore, so everything that's done in her name is not really representative. She does have her own personal store, which is Urban Zen, and she has 2 of them now, or maybe 3 actually. Her husband, Stephen Weiss, died of cancer, and that changed everything for her. So she started the Urban Zen Foundation, and she does an incredible collection through Urban Zen, which is all funds Haitian artisanship. She was part of the Clinton Global Initiative that visited Haiti after the earthquake, and so all of her accessories, jewelry, and home products for the store are produced by Haitian artisans. Absolutely exquisite, taste level is gorgeous. The collection is not produced there, but it's not for profit, so the funds go towards the foundation, and it is, you have to visit the website, it's to die for collection, it really is. Transparency I touched on yesterday, so Everlane is one of those, for example, that put everything online. They're completely digital brand, they don't sell in stores, there's no bricks and mortars, there's no agents, they don't do fashion shows, they don't do trade shows. All of those things are eliminated from their costing, making their prices actually much more accessible. If you go in, you'll see each of their pieces are priced. They'll tell you what the costing is, because they don't go the traditional retail, so there isn't a wholesaler, there isn't the retail markup, they sell directly to customer, and they break down all of their prices. And the last thing I'm going to touch on is cultural appropriation. Particularly in the educational sphere, and as designers, we're taught that we can just pull on any sort of inspiration from anyone around the world, and the world is our oyster, and we can utilize other people's culture as our base of inspiration anytime we want, without any consideration of ever asking those people if they're okay with it, or in any sort of recompense, which is why working with communities is really important. And this is an undertaking of the Maasai in Kenya. There are over 1,000 companies use the Maasai in the name or in the branding of their products, make enormous profits from it. Louis Vuitton did an entire collection from it. There are cars named after the Maasai. So the monies that are made by utilizing a culture who is struggling for land rights, water access, schooling, education, and healthcare, while there are thousands and thousands of dollars made on the profits of use of their name. So they're in the process of developing, have been since 2010 actually, an intellectual property right for indigenous people, which will protect their own cultural symbols as intellectual property. So if you want to be using the Maasai as a form of inspiration for your collection going ahead, you're going to have to pay rights to them, as indeed you should. So if this goes the way it should, the intent is this is an indigenous peoples agreement. It's not specific to the Maasai. So that could and should roll out to First Nations in the US and any number of native communities around the world. Stella Jean, a Haitian designer out of Italy, I'm going to finish up with her, who works with, her production is done in Africa, it's all done out of Dutch cottons. Stunning collection out of Italy. She's half Italian, half Haitian. Father was Roman, she lives in Rome, so they're produced in Italy, but the collection is drop dead gorgeous, and it's produced in Africa with the ITC program and the World Trade and the United Nations, as is Laurent Zerline, who's a French designer, does menswear, very similar story. So I just think, I'm going to finish up with, I think it's absolutely vital that we understand as designers that we have an enormous potential to impact how we design and what materials we choose, what processes we choose, and how we do it. As consumers, and we're all consumers, we also have an enormous amount of power to wield with our wallets. We all work pretty hard for those dollars and pounds that we earn, and you have the choice of deciding how you spend it and what you're investing in, whether that's the coffee that you buy on a daily basis or whether it's the garments that you're purchasing, whether they're vintage or whether they're fast fashion and they're being thrown away. And I think it's really important that we understand that collectively we have an enormous power to change our industry and to change our consumption patterns. Thank you.